esteemed Vice Chancellor, Deans actually of many departments, members of the staff, dear students. I'm happy to be here once again. I was here some time back for a seminar on women's writing in India. And, I have been to, I think, all the major academic institutions in Hyderabad. And I'm happy to be here once again to talk to you on a topic that has been a much debated one about the nature of Indian literature, whether it is singular or plural. I have a written text. I may use it, I may not use it, I'm not sure about it. I'll begin with a story not by A.K. Ramanujan, retold by A.K. Ramanujan, which is in fact a Kannada folk tale around Ramayana. One day, Rama was sitting in his court along with his wise counsels, the great rishis, when he lost his ring, the ring on the index finger. The ring fell down on the floor and disappeared through a hole in the floor. He wanted to retrieve it, and who but Hanuman would help him. So he asked Hanuman, please go and pick up this ring. Because he knew, as you well know, that Hanuman has this power to become as big as a mountain or as small as a mosquito. So he had to go through this small hole, and so Hanuman immediately said he would do that. So he grew small and went through this hole and reached the netherworld. While he was falling down from the earth to the netherworld, the cooks in the court's kitchen, the women, saw Hanuman falling, and they had a king who was fond of non-vegetarian food, and they thought that this is a new kind of beast and maybe their king might like it immensely. So they put this little animal along with all his vegetables and various kinds of meat on the big platter for the dinner. When the king came to dine, he heard someone chanting Ram, Ram from the plate. He looked at his plate of food and found that this chanting was coming from his food. And he found that it was actually a little animal which was chanting Ram, Ram. He wanted to know who he was. He looked at Hanuman and asked him, who are you? And then Hanuman told him the whole story, that he is King Ram's messenger. And he also explained his mission, why he is here. He wanted to take back a ring that Ram had lost. The king then brought to him a huge platter, a huge plate full of rings, and asked him to pick up his Rama's particular ring. Hanuman was at a loss. He never knew that there were so many Rams, and he was unable actually to pick up his Ram's ring. And then the king of the netherworld told Hanuman, well, there have been so many Ramas across ages, and every time Ram is about to die or to ascend to heaven, as they say, his ring, the ring on his index finger, falls down through a hole and it reaches the netherworld. And I have collected all those rings, and that's what you find on this platter. And he also said, it means that your Ram also is probably no more there on earth. He must have by now entered Sarayu and found his salvation. Hanuman went back to discover that, yes, after crowning his sons, Lava and Kush, already Ram had left the earth because his mission for this particular incarnation was over, and he could not find Ram anymore. Always, whenever I think of the nature of Indian literature, I find this story handy to explain its plurality and also, in some sense, its continuity. I will not go into the history of the Ramayanas in the country, which is quite another topic on which maybe at some point of time I would like to talk to you. But you very well know that we have so many Ramayanas. And you know how in Delhi University, A.K. Ramanujan's famous essay, 300 Ramayanas, one of the most scholarly essays of Ramanujan, was prescribed and then withdrawn under pressure from a particular section, which unfortunately believed that there can only be one Rama and there can only be one Ramayana, while we have had thousands of Ramas and thousands of Ramayanas. Because we have, Ramanujan speaks of 300 Ramayanas, but if you speak of all the oral Ramayanas and the written Ramayanas, the painted Ramayanas, the carved Ramayanas and the performed Ramayanas, it will go to thousands. So we have thousands of versions of Ramayana, each different from the other. Of course, in every Ramayana, there is a Ram, there is a Sita, and there is Lakshman, and there is Ravan. But for this, things are so different. Even the relationships are so different. There are Ramayanas where Sita is Ravan's daughter, so he commits, he aspires to commit a crime of incest with Sita. There are Ramayanas where Sita is Ravan's sister. There are Ramayanas where Lakshman kills Ravan and not Rama. There are Ramayanas like the Jain and the Buddhist Ramayanas where in the end all those, including Ravan, become monks, Buddhist or Jain monks or sannyasins. So we have several versions of the story of Rama. And you can never say that one particular version is the authentic version, whether it is Valmiki's version or whether it is the different versions we have in the languages. In Malayalam, we have 24 Ramayanas, besides at least 120 poems and stories written around Ramayana, including some very contemporary reinterpretations of Ramayana, like the Rama stories written by Sarah Joseph, who has written a whole series of stories based on the characters in Ramayana, looking at them from a feminist point of view. And recently, Paula Richman has in fact come out with a wonderful collection of those contemporary Ramayana stories in the South, which is her last book. Of course, before that, you know her famous books, interrogating, the questioning Ramayanas, a South Asian tradition, for example, and her general work on Ramayana and the characters in Ramayana and their representation in different kinds of texts and different kinds of contexts. Well, I'm not going into that whole story, but I would just like to say that Ramayana is not a text but a tradition, as is perhaps also Mahabharata. And let me also add that perhaps these are not the two only epics we have, even though generally whenever we speak of our epic tradition, we speak of Ramayana and Mahabharata, or maybe we go to a Purana like Bhagavata. But then there are more than 1,000 oral epics still existing among our people, mainly the tribal people, which have nothing to do with Rama or Sita or Krishna or Karna. Ramayanas, epics where there are totally different characters, like Malle Madeshwara, the Kannada epic, or like Pabuji, the Rajasthani epic. There are thousands of such epics which are being sung even today. I have listened to a Pili singing of an epic, a night-long singing, because the singers know the whole epic by heart, because it exists only in the oral tradition. And so there are many other epics. That is, by the way, that is something about our understanding of the epic tradition which needs perhaps a kind of correction. But I cited this I refer to this story of this folktale retold by A.K. Ramanujan, chiefly to say that if there are hundreds of Ramas, there must be hundreds of Ramayanas. And if there are hundreds of Ramayanas, it is also likely that there are hundreds of concepts of what India is and what Indian literature is or must be. At the same time, as I said, all these Ramayanas have certain things in common, and it is quite likely that Indian literature also has a lot of things in common. There is continuity, there are breaks. And I'll try to do a brief examination of these continuities and breaks, and then try to find an answer, maybe not an answer, but a temporary kind of response to this question of whether, the question whether Indian literature is singular or plural. Generally, there are at least 2 or 3 positions taken on this question of the singular or the plural nature of Indian literature. One well-known position is a statement made by S. Radhakrishnan, who was, as you very well know, the President of India and also one of the presidents of the Sahitya Akademi, the National Academy of Literature. He said, which later also became a kind of slogan for the whole of Sahitya Akademi, Indian literature is one, though written in different languages. That is one well-known, well-entrenched position on Indian literature, that it is one, even though it is written in different languages. Of course, we shall examine these positions a little more closely soon. The second is the very opposite. Nihonjin Ray, a well-known Bengali critic, once said that there is no single language called Indian language, and literature being essentially based on languages, essentially being a linguistic phenomenon, there cannot also be a single Indian literature. Because we have so many languages, so we can speak of Telugu literature, of Malayalam literature, of Hindi and Urdu literatures, but not of an Indian literature, since there is no single language called Indian. The third position, which is not perhaps very well known, is a statement that was made almost casually by U.R. Ananthamurthy, who also was a later president of the Sahitya Akademi and a very well-known Kannada writer whom you are familiar very much with. Ananthamurthy once said, if we look for the unity of Indian literature, we come across its infinite diversity. And if we look for the diversity of Indian literature, we come across its astonishing unity. Perhaps there is greater truth in this kind of dialectical statement than in the two statements which represent two polarities in the views about Indian literature. Because it is possible to examine the whole history of Indian literature from the point of view of diversity and find out different ages in the evolution of Indian literature where they have evolved independently of one another. They have evolved their own special genres, their own special ways of looking at the world and ways of representing the world and ways of using language. But you will also find, if you look for those movements which were common to various literatures in India, that there have been a lot of exchanges among the different Indian languages. There are many common forms, shared concerns, a shared ethos very often, and a shared understanding of the world, and many common ways shared by all the languages of representing the world and representing Indian history, Indian myth, and Indian reality. We may look at these arguments a little closer. First, the argument of Nihonjin Ray. In his own words, I quote from his book Towards a Literary History of India. Literature is absolutely language-based, and language being a cultural phenomenon, it is all but wholly conditioned by the locale and the socio-historical forces that are in operation through the ages in that particular locale. If that be so, one may reasonably argue that the literature of a given language will have its own specific character of a form and style, images and symbols, nuances and associations. It is true that often Indian tends to imply the values which argue for the cultural unity of India as a whole. The use of English to write about literature in Indian languages seems to reinforce such a view. As E.V. Ramakrishna, who is a very close student of Indian literature, we have only very few, in fact, who have written generally on Indian literature and the issues that the whole concept raises. And Shishir Kumar Das is certainly one. K.M. George has done some work in comparative literature. P.P. Ravindran has done some work. Indranath Chowdhury has done some work. E.V. Ramakrishnan has done, and I have also tried to do some work in the area. So there are very few people who have tried to look at the common issues in Indian literature on a pan-Indian kind of scale. So Ramakrishnan observes in the introduction to his book, Making It New, Modernism in Malayalam, Marathi and Hindi Poetry, which I think as comparatist you must be familiar with. It's published by the Institute of Advanced Studies in Shimla. The framework of grand narratives of history cannot accommodate the subversive function of the new trends in literature unless they become domesticated and canonized. I quote from this particular book by E.V. Ramakrishnan. The leveling effect of history and the domestication implicit in canonicity finally fossilize authors and works, leaving no trace of their relevance to our present. We also have to recognize the fact that the gap between the national and the regional has been problematized by the post-colonial vocabularies of identity and difference and centrality and plurality. Well, this is, as you very well know, an idea of a developing debate about the nation itself, because there is a crisis perhaps in the federal polity, and this crisis of the idea of federalism has also led to a discussion on the importance of the regions, the identity of the languages and regional cultures, and their threatened absorption by what is often called an Indian culture, whose existence has always been ambiguous. In the sense, we are not exactly sure, or at least we have different ideas when we say Indian culture. We have, because very often I do not want to again enter that area of profound contest, because very often, for example, when we say Indian culture, I often wonder whether many of us have in mind, for example, the different tribal cultures in India. Have we thought of the northeastern states of India as part of India ever? When we say that, for example, Ramayana and Mahabharata are common to India, do the people of Meghalaya, do the people of Arunachal, do they recognize Mahabharata and Ramayana as their epics? I do not think so. So what I mean is we should be extremely careful, and there are gaps, there are silences in our understanding and in the ways we represent Indian culture, which also applies to Indian literature. When we speak of a pan-Indian literature, we do not often take into account a lot of literary expressions in the neglected languages, in the dialects, in the various kinds of tribal tongues, and various literatures which are seldom represented in our mainstream understanding or mainstream idea of Indian literature. Because that is an area that I think we need to specifically ponder over and try to find the gaps and silences in our understanding of Indian literature as a whole. Many comparative literature scholars like K.M. George and Shishir Kumar Das have attempted composite histories of Indian literature. You can one example would be K.M. George's Comparative Indian Literature, and another would be Shishir Kumar Das's work, A History of Indian Literature, which he could not complete. Unfortunately, he passed away before that because it is an ambitious scheme and he could do only 2 volumes and part of another volume. Shishir Kumar, and there's something interesting about the history of these volumes also, because I was in some sense associated with this whole project. He started writing an integrated history of Indian literature. And very soon he found that it was impossible to write an integrated history of Indian literature, because that would again leave a lot of areas uncovered. And so he decided to write a history of Indian literature and bring in not an integrated history, but ultimately he did not call it a comparative history, but ultimately he would end up writing a comparative history of Indian literature. At least as the 2 volumes he has written and published suggest, it is a comparative history and not an integrated history, because you do not know what all are going to be crushed in that terrible process of integration, as it sometimes happens even in our national integration, so sadly. So he looks at the history of Indian literature as the history, this is Shishir Kumar Das, the history of the total literary activity of the Indian people, an account of all literary traditions, great and little, their ramifications and changes, their recessions and revivals, dominance and decline. This is how he defines his project of attempting to write a history of Indian literature. So, in fact, a literary text produced in one Indian language, that's what many of the scholars agree on and say. The one particular, you take any literary text, say something by Chalam here, or something by some other author in Malayalam or Hindi or any of the languages, a literary text produced in Indian language answers a certain need or performs a historical function in the context of specific linguistic community, and its meaning lies essentially in its specificity. Each text has its own history. It has its place in a particular language, its place in a particular culture. This Chalam would be a good example again, because that is the time when issues were coming up. He wanted to write about the great issues, for example, that women's pathetic, women's tragic state threw up in his time, and so he wanted to speak about dowry. He wanted to speak about a lot of issues around women and generally around the inequality of various kinds existing in the society. And so that was a time of struggle, a time of renaissance, a time of the waking up of the people, and you cannot completely isolate Chalam's text from the particular context that gave rise to his text. And this can be said of Thakazhi Shivashankara Pillai or Shivarama Karanth or Premchand or any of those, especially those realist writers who critiqued the society of their time. So they came up from a particular milieu, cultural and linguistic milieu. And this relationship of the text to its context gets blurred or distorted when we abstract a text in an Indian language into the realm of national literary history. Very often we tend to lose sight of the specific socio-linguistic context of a text when we call it, for example, an Indian novel, or when we call something an Indian poem. No, I'm not saying that we should not call it, but if we call it, we should be also conscious of the fact that there is a whole history behind that text. There is a literary history, there is a linguistic history, there is social history. In order to understand how a poet or a fiction writer radicalizes the literary idiom, it is necessary to grasp the specific history of that literature along with its social background from which the literary registers spring. There is, in addition, the question of the overlapping of various tendencies at the same juncture in most Indian languages. So different tendencies overlap at the same time they come up in the Indian languages, and there is an overlapping. In Malayalam, for example, even now, there are romantic poets following an older idiom, jostling with those who consider themselves postmodern and experiment with the avant-garde idioms. So that is one thing peculiar to Indian literatures, and many literatures which have received the impact of the West at a particular point of time. In the West, you can follow the history of literature and you can connect it easily with the social movements and also philosophical movements, philosophical trends like Romanticism, British Romanticism. You can speak specifically about the influences of critique of pure reason. A lot of philosophical texts on literature and the idea of literature. But in India, you find many times coexisting. In social life too, many times coexist, and this happens also in literature. So if you look at the different writers writing today, you'll find that they are writing in many ways. You will find somebody calling himself a modern, Athunik or Naveen or whatever it is in the Indian terminology. Somebody may say that he is an Uttar Athunik or a postmodern, and somebody may continue to write in the way in which Premchand or Thakazhi wrote, in a very realistic kind of way, and they coexist. At least in time. If you can take a cross section of time, as Althusser would say, in that case, in that sense, all of them seem to coexist. But at the same time, they also belong to different periods of literary history. They are there, and they may be of the same age even. But if you look at the evolution of literature, you may see that they belong to different periods in literary history. This is something very specific to India and maybe to especially colonized countries where a lot of Western philosophy and Western literature came together. Many movements came together. So some got stuck in some of those movements. Some moved out and created new movements, or they tried to be contemporary with the world. So in many ways, you find many kinds of texts, many kinds of tonalities, sensibilities, textures coexisting at the same time. This gets further complicated if we introduce the element of ideology that, according to Mikhail Bakhtin, is inscribed in the language. If we introduce another element, the ideology, this is Bakhtin's famous statement that ideology is inscribed in language, and whoever uses language has no escape from ideology in some sense. In short, there are problems of chronology, of synchrony or diachrony, of ideology, and of terminology involved in the consideration of the singular or the plural nature of Indian literature. So there is a chronological question, there is an ideological question of the period and the kind of general inspiration that the writers received, and also of the kinds of terms that we use to qualify specific texts and specific movements in Indian literature. Now let us look at the other argument, Nihonjin Ray. While Nihonjin Ray is not without some followers in contemporary India, it is also possible to interrogate his general approach to literature as something tied entirely and inextricably to the language in which it is originally written. So, the argument of Nihonjin Ray that there is no Indian literature comes from this foundation that literature is always written in a language, and since there is no Indian language, a single language called Indian, there cannot be an Indian literature. But this can also be interrogated and contested. Language cannot be the only criterion of literature. Other criteria have been applied to literature by literary critics: social, cultural, political, ethical, aesthetic, various kinds of criteria have been applied to literature from time to time. It can be and has been categorized, read, and analyzed from the point of view of class, race, caste, because we speak of black literature, we speak of Dalit literature, we speak of women's literature, gender, myth, archetype, sign, structure, ideology, and textual unconscious. So I'm not going into the exam because post-structuralism is one of my special areas of study. So I'm not going into the details of these movements like structuralist and post-structuralist modes of analysis and how they employ criteria other than language. So go to Mashiri, go to Eagleton, go to Rak Ransi or Ramvilas Sharma or Namar Singh or Frederick Jameson or Raymond Williams. You will find them applying different, even within people who belong to the same, who apparently belong to the same kind of larger framework. Like Marxism, for example, you will find a lot of difference because Jameson looks at literature in a way which is very different from the way in which Raymond Williams would, or the old Lunacharsky would look at literature. So even within common traditions, there are a lot of differences, disagreements, and diversity in the way they look at literature, evaluate literature. And again, I'm not giving so many examples. Women critics among the Beauvais or Ellen Showalter or Mary Ellman, Gilbert and Gibbon, they look at literature from a woman's point of view. Literature, text as something being organized around the female body or female desire. And then you have those who speak about a black literature and how race is expressed in literature, similar to Dalit literature in India. And there are psycholinguists, Raclacan, or semiologists like Roland Barthes, structuralists like Piaget and Paul de Man, and post-structuralists like Derrida and Foucault and Richard Rorty, who have developed novel ways of reading, reconstructing, and deconstructing texts. So don't worry about the names. It simply means that we have not, critics have not looked at literature only from the point of view of the language in which it is written, but from diverse points of view. And secondly, all literatures are not known by the language in which they are written. It is true, very often they are. Like when we say Kannada literature or Telugu literature, we are using a nomenclature derived from the particular language. But sometimes it is not necessarily so. For example, when we say English literature, so it may encompass British, American, Australian, Canadian, or even Indian English literature. Or you can call them also using the names of the countries from which they spring. You speak of American literature, for example, as a specific entity within English literature. Or you can put many literatures together and give them a common name. For example, when you use the term European literature, so you are speaking about French and Italian and Spanish and quite a few other literatures in Europe. So literatures have been named also, not necessarily based on language but on other criteria, on nations or even continents, as in the case of Europe. So there can be the term Indian literature. I mean, it's also as a term it can be legitimated by comparing it with something like European literature or American literature, where a kind of national nomenclature is provided to literatures written in various countries. In the words of distinguished Marxist theoretician Aijaz Ahmad, I'm sure you have read In Theory and his essay on Indian literature, multilingualism and polyglot fluidity, these are the terms he uses, are in the very nature of Indian creativity. Multilingualism and polyglot fluidity. Being multilingual, moving from one language to another very easily. That is the polyglot fluidity. Moving from one language to the other smoothly. These are supposed to be supposed to be in the very nature of India's imagination and India's creativity. We have Indian writers of the past like Kabir or Namdev, who wrote in Punjabi and varieties of Hindi. Mirabai, who is claimed as much by, as you very well know, by Gujarati and by Braj Bhasha and by Rajasthani. Guru Nanak, who easily switched over from Persian to Kaifi and Lahudi, which were considered dialects, but which the speakers will say are languages. That is another question, which again I am not entering, what is a dialect and what is a language. And generally it is said that when the dialect has a political party and an army, it becomes a language. I don't want to comment more on it in the place where the Telangana struggle is on. Well, Vidyapati, who belonged equally to Sanskrit and Maithili and Avahata. So, in short, there have been writers in our tradition, very important writers in our tradition, who have not written, because these people did not write. Most of them were singing, or they were oral poets who chanted or sang or created verses in different languages at the same time, because they were not even conscious of the language in which they were speaking. They would naturally switch the language when they crossed the border of a state. When they found that people were speaking another language, they would naturally switch over to that language. So because they knew, they were familiar with at least 4 to 5 languages, most of these writers. Only now perhaps we are becoming more and more monolingual, not even bilingual, more monolingual with English as the only our mother tongue and our father tongue, which is a pity. In the modern times, we have many writers who belong to the composite Hindu-Urdu tradition that can perhaps be called the Hindustani tradition, like Premchand himself. He wrote in what is today called Urdu. Again, that is another politics again, which I don't want to enter. What is Urdu? What is Hindi? Is there something called Hindi? Is there something called Urdu? Don't they have a common name called Hindustani? These are questions which with a lot of social and political and even religious implications. So we have, but we still have people who write in different languages. Especially, there are many writers who write in their mother tongue plus Urdu. Say someone like Muhammad Alvi of Gujarat, he writes in Gujarati, or Jayant Parmar, he writes in Gujarati, he writes also in Urdu. Or there are people who write in Dogri and Hindi, and there are many who wrote in and who even now write in the mother tongue and also English. A.K. Ramanujan himself, he wrote in Kannada, he knew also Tamil, he translated from Tamil, he wrote also in English, both poetry and criticism. Or somebody like Jayanta Mahapatra, who is mainly considered an Indian English poet, but who also writes in Oriya, or R. Parthasarathi, or we had Kamala Das in Kerala, who wrote poetry in English and fiction in Malayalam, even though she later wrote some poetry also in Malayalam. But she is essentially known as a short story writer to the Malayalis. So we have had writers, and even now we have some writers who continue to be bilingual or sometimes even trilingual. So the tradition is not entirely dead, even though, as I said, it is being threatened today, because it looks like that with one language we can make our livelihood, we can express ourselves, and we seem to think so, and hence perhaps there is a major threat to our mother tongues and the languages, which is an issue to be taken up separately and discussed. And thirdly, what is thirdly? The secondly means second is the multilingualism and polyglot. You cannot say which is the language of a particular writer. You have had many writers writing in different languages. And the first point was that if we can speak of European literature, American literature, we can also speak of an Indian literature. And thirdly, most Indian languages share a lot of genres and forms, from the Mahakavya, Doha, Prabandha, Prahasana, Nataka, and ballad to sonnet, elegy, lyric, narrative poem, short story, and the novel. I am not saying that all the Indian languages share all of them, but many Indian languages share many of these forms. And again, fourthly, they also share concepts of poetics, both Oriental and Occidental. If you look at criticism in the different languages, you will find a lot of them using common concepts from poetics, like rasa or dhvani, alankara, anumana, vakrokti, bhava and vibhava, to the Western concepts like mimesis, catharsis, metaphor, metonymy, suggestion, myth, archetype, and several others which have come from Western criticism, or more contemporary terms, concepts and methods. So there is a sharing of poetics or concepts, aesthetic and poetic concepts. And fifthly, many literatures in India share literary influences as well as trends and movements, like the Bhakti, the nationalist or the Swarajist movement, the progressive or the Pragadivadi movement, the modernist or the Adhunik movements, known in different names in different languages, and the later trends like postmodernist or Uttar Adhunik, nativist or Deshivadi, ecological or Prakritivadi or Paristhidivadi, or feminist or Narivadi, Dalit and tribal or Adivasi movements. Many of these movements are found in many languages in India. Again, not in all languages, but they are shared movements. Even though the way these social groups express themselves may be different, but there is a common and shared tradition to these movements in the different languages of India. And this is besides shared patterns of thought, feeling, concerns, and their modes of expression. So there are things that we seem to share. And these are the common features, taking into account which S. Radhakrishnan said that Indian literature is one, even though written in different languages. We should also look at the problem with this approach, because we are going to actually moving towards a kind of approach between the two, a comparative approach. One problem with this approach is that it is reductive and tends to standardize all the literatures of India, and in the process leaves out and thus alienates many literatures like the oral tribal literatures of the Northeast, and of certain languages and dialects where the history has proceeded in other directions and which have had little impact of the West. There are many literatures on which there has been absolutely no Western impact at all. This dilemma was best summed up. That is how I quoted Anandamurti in the beginning. Look for the unity, you find the diversity, and look for the diversity, and you get the unity. This is in fact a statement that is nearer the truth than the positions expressed by either Nihonjin Ray or S. Radhakrishnan. For while there have been pan-Indian trends and movements, there have also been regional ones, and even the pan-Indian movements like Bhakti have manifested themselves in different forms in different Indian languages. It is also not true to say that all the movements have affected all the literatures alike, or that the influences from outside the languages, Indian or otherwise, have had the same impact across languages. That is, when you look closely, you will find, even though the West has impacted in a big way, not that the same text or the same trends have impacted. in all the languages, and nor to the same degree. So even in the influence study, it's called the impact study or the influence studies, which is one branch of comparative literature. Even there you will find a difference in the degree of impact and in the texts and the movements which have impacted different literatures. There are also forms that are unique to certain languages. I spoke about certain common forms, but there are also forms which are unique to certain languages. Say like to take two examples from my familiar language Malayalam, the Plural poem or the Kathakali verse, which does not exist in any other Indian language, or the cartoon poem, or there is something, Malayalam has something called the Patala Katha, which is the barrack stories. The stories, we have had at least 5 major writers who wrote stories about soldiers or the life of the soldiers, and that has become a genre in itself. The barrack story. There are such stories in other languages, but it is not a movement. It cannot be cited as a kind of trend. Or look at Bijak or Ramayana, which are peculiar to ancient Braj and used by Kabir, or Pillai Padal. They are lullabies, but lullabies of a particular kind in Tamil. Or in Tamil has many such Chintha kind of song, or Akaval, which is a metric mode in narratives, or Venpa, which is used for didactic kinds of works, or Kalippa for love poetry and for choral music, or Vanchipa for descriptive situations, or Kummi, which is a song for dancing women, which is shared also in the south generally, and Kanni, which is a couplet form in Tamil, or Abhang in Marathi. Tukaram's Abhangs are so well known, especially as sung by Kumar Gandharva and other major musicians, and Vachana in Kannada, or Vak, V-A-K-H in Kashmiri. Lal Ded wrote what is called Vak. So these are all forms of bhakti poetry, and they are unique to their languages. Unique. Vachana, for example, is unique to Kannada. There are forms which can be compared, but not quite the same. If you look at the syntax, if you look at the way the rhythms and rhymes are used, the way the thought is articulated, it is something very unique to Kannada. Or similarly, Rubai or Masnavi or Kavali or Manakub or Nama or Kasida or Kitta or what you call Kissa in Urdu. So many of our languages have their own very specific forms too. This is also true of the concepts of poetics. I said there are many common things that languages share, like the Dhwani and Rasa and all that, and also Western concepts. But there are also languages which do not generally follow Sanskrit poetics or even Western poetics, and again Tamil would be a good example. It had its own concepts, like that of the Tinai or the terrains with their peculiar moods and contexts. Their Uri and Mudal, like Kurinchi, whose Mudal is mountain and Uri is Punardal or premarital union. Marutam, which belongs to lowland, because it is it's a kind of eco aesthetics, and the subject is marital union or sulking over infidelity, or Neithal, that happens on the seashore, and its Uri means a particular life context, that is Iranagal, or anxious pining in the state of separation by a woman or a man, mainly a woman. Or Mullai, forest of pasture, and the Uri is a patient waiting, or Palai, whose Mutal means the location, the locale. Locale is the desert, and Uri is Pirital or separation. And Tolhapiam has many other concepts which are very unique to Tamil, like Meipad, which is comparable to the Rasas, but described in a very, very different way. Uvakai is close to Shingara, Nakai is close to Hasya, Alukai is close to Karuna, but many such. I am not again going into all those details. And there are also concepts like Ullurai. Connotatively, it is close to Dhwani, but it is not the same as Dhwani. And Urdu has inherited a lot of concepts from the Perso-Arabic critical tradition. One can also see that different languages have appropriated Sanskrit and the Western concepts in poetics with a nuance and semantic shifts. So Dhwani does not mean the same thing, for example, in Malayalam and maybe in Gujarati. So they mean often, I mean, these are very extremely nuanced interpretations, often not exactly the same things, but different things. We have, all the languages have interpreted these things in different ways. So again, some forms are common to many languages, but not to all. Like the ghazal. The ghazal came from the Persian and then it was developed in Urdu. But then now we have practitioners of the form in Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, and even in English. Aga Shahid Ali wrote ghazals in English. It's one example. So this is also true of neoclassical forms like Champu or Sandesha Kavya, or movements like Dalit literature shared by, say, Marathi, Gujarati, Hindi, Punjabi, Kannada, Tamil, Telugu, and more recently Malayalam. Even a pan-Indian tendency like the progressive literary movement was stronger in languages like Urdu, Hindi, Oriya, Bengali, Telugu, and Malayalam than in others. So even when we say there are common movements, they are often confined to certain languages, or in some languages they are expressed very strongly, and in some languages not so strongly, not so dominantly. Because there was no dominant progressive literature in that sense in Kannada, for example, as it happened in Telugu, or it happened even in Malayalam. In short, while languages have interacted from time to time and received forms, trends, and movements from other regions and languages, each language has had also periods of isolated growth and its own special genius, just as each region in India has its own customs, celebrations, forms of art and literature, and at times even certain temperamental tendencies. Indian culture is a mosaic of cultures, religions, races, languages, attitudes, and worldviews. Hence, the concept of Indian literature also has to be open, inclusive, dynamic, and flexible so that it accommodates diverse voices of the majority as well as the religious, linguistic, ethnic, and sexual minorities. I have a whole long section which I am going to leave out on the history of Indian literature and the various kinds of movements in Indian literature. I don't think, because I was sometimes reading and sometimes also trying to explain, and I'm not very sure I have the time to go through all that. What I am trying to say here briefly is that the roots of our literature can be traced to the oral lore or the tribal literatures. I mean, to the Adivasis, who were the first inhabitants of India, the first poets, the first philosophers, the first scientists. And so there were many languages spoken, mainly Austroasiatic languages, who shared, but these poets shared a common kind of myth-making or mythopoeic imagination with the Adivasis all over the world. Riddles and proverbs and songs related to daily life and labor and magic and ritual, hymns and hymns to natural forces and to mother goddesses, poems for various occasions in human life. All these and uninhibited expressions of love. These are in fact common to tribal literatures across the world, which you find also in the tribal literatures in India. So and they were the creators also of the microliths and the megaliths, which have survived to the present, like the Thangars or the Peels created these stone memorials, which are there, along with their songs and stories, which have survived to our own time, and then we have the civilization of the Indus Valley. Again, I'm not going into that because I'm entering history and trying to look at different views by R.S. Sharma and D.D. Kosambi and other historians about the Indus Valley civilization. But to our discussion, it is enough to know that we do not know much about that literature. There must have been a literature, but the Sainthav script has not been decoded. People have claimed that they have decoded, but it has not been proved by the scholars, historians, and linguists. And hence, we do not know what kind of literature exactly existed. We know something about their mythology, but we know very little about their literatures. So there are, that's another area altogether. You read a book like Myth and Reality by D.D. Kosambi, or his studies in his introduction to the study of Indian history, and you will find how he traces many of the myths and gods and goddesses to various kinds of Tilmoon and Mesopotamian and various kinds of legends in other parts of the world. I have spent quite a few pages on that, on the relationship between Darius and Indian myths and all that. But we know that something happened during that period. I mean, at the end of that period, one race came from outside. We tend to call them Aryans, but somebody like Romela Thapar would not agree with that, because her latest book, Aryans, says that there was there was no race called Aryans. There was only a language family called Aryans. Well, I'm not saying that she is right or somebody else is wrong, but then it is quite possible that it was the name given to a group of languages spoken by those people who had come mainly from Central Asia at that time. And they had brought their own gods and goddesses, who to some extent the Vedic gods. So the Vedic gods replaced the gods, the earlier gods, who are generally again known as Dravidian gods, or gods like Shiva and Parvati, gods like Muruga, like Kali. They are known by different names, like Kottavai. But then these gods and goddesses were replaced. So there was a whole new mythology, a new iconography, a new set of gods and goddesses, and they also brought with them probably their own songs and their verses and mantras. And so we have the Vedas coming up, the different Vedas as the first examples of not the first. There was pre-Vedic poetry, but generally supposed to be one of the originaries, one of the beginnings or sources of Indian literature. So we have these Vedas, which are not in Sanskrit, but in a Vedic language, which is a pre-Sanskritic kind of language. So we have the Vedas and the Upanishads. In fact, I used to say that these are also an extensions in some sense of tribal literature, even though that might be shocking to many, but actually these were composed by Gotras, and Gotra is our word for a tribe. A tribe which goes with the cattle, Gotra, one who protects the cow, the cattle. So these tribes which had come from outside, maybe they also mingled with the tribes who were already existing here. So they together produced the Vedas, and then we had the Upanishads. Again, I have pages on them which I am not speaking about. And following that, we have the epics. Mainly the well-known epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And I am also trying to say how Ramayana is not a text but a tradition, and how Mahabharata too was not a single text. It came from different traditions, and they merged into a single text much later. It is actually a polyphonic work that has been read from varying perspectives. Critics and scholars like Iravati Karve and Kutikshna Marar have found it to be an immortal record of the complex human condition and a mirror held to the various masks that we wear. This version of Mahabharata refuses to idolize its characters, unlike some popular versions of Ramayana, where Rama is an adorable and infallible hero. So this is about the well-known Mahabharata of Vyasa. No character here is beyond questioning. Contradictions assail their character. At the same time, the conduct of each character is justified in his or her specific context. Iravati Karve in her Yugand has shown how even epic heroes and heroines are not above human failings. Duryodhana's anger is not baseless, as he had been disgraced by the Pandavas. The wise Bhishma is trying to bring peace, but the attempt leads to great injustices. The events that follow lead to the feud between the families that finally ruins both. Gandhari, who is upheld as an ideal wife, had actually been tricked into marrying the blind prince and walked blindfolded to remind the family of her husband of their cruelty and generate in them a sense of guilt. The noble Arjuna, the great warrior that he is, falters before the enemy and is shown to be weak before the king and the teacher he has to fight. And the same warrior has little hesitation in committing genocide, destroying the whole race of the Nagas, joining hands with Krishna and Agni. Even Draupadi, one of the most celebrated women of all time, suffered from arrogance and obstinacy that caused her a lot of pain. Krishna, who is supposedly an incarnation of Vishnu, is Machiavellian in his plans against the Kauravas. In fact, these characters and many others appear as our contemporaries or our own images in their strengths as well as their weaknesses. This ability to address the present and relate to different contexts in life is one of the major qualities of this epic. That is why Mahabharata is being used even today in different ways, interpreted. A lot of fiction and poetry are written around the characters and episodes in the Mahabharata, because it seems to be speaking to generations with, of course, differing meanings. And there is the possibility of various forms of various kinds of interpretation which are being used by the playwrights and the novelist too in a big way. Mahabharata was also a text that evolved over time. Its first version was called Jaya, that had only 8,800 verses, and later it grew into Bharata, which is 24,000 verses, chanted by Shampayana during Janamejaya's Sarpasatra, or the serpent sacrifice. It was during the Yajna conducted by Saunaka in the Naimisharanya that it attained its present form with more than 1 lakh verses. So it evolved over time. It took stories from the Naga tales, Kuru tales, Puru tales. These were brought together in a single huge epic. So today it is something like an encyclopedia of ancient Indian culture and a compendium of myths and legends from varied sources. Again, Kosambi has observed that Krishna was later deified and the Bhagavad Gita was added to the text much later in order to Brahminize the whole epic. The origin of the epic is connected to the hymns of Rigveda and literary genres like Idihasas, Akhyanas and Puranas. Several gathas and episodes like the Sarpakhyan relating to the tale of Kadru and Vinata in the Ashtika Parva are later added. The chanters have also added many narrative poems and genealogies of dynasties. So I am looking at the structure of Mahabharata and how combining various kinds of stories and episodes and the tales of different clans, Mahabharata finally came to be. And Ramayana again is not, as I said, an individual text, but a multiple tradition. Then we perhaps after the epics, the major movement that seemed to have founded Indian literature is what has been called the bhakti. The bhakti, as you perhaps very well know, was a kind of radical spiritual movement that interrogated the existing norms of the society and also the existing hierarchies and the hegemony of certain languages and sections of the society. It shows great diversity. Even though we call it a common tradition, it also shows great diversity in its central icons like Shiva, Vishnu, Shakti and their regional variants. Modes of worship, forms of expression, organization and propagation, and the forms of art, murals, sculpture, architecture, music and dance, it gave birth to. It also had its hegemonic and subaltern elements And though pan-Indian, in a broad sense, there were regions and communities not directly affected by the movement, especially tribal ones, who had their own gods and goddesses, systems of faith and worship, and cosmologies independent of what has been called Hindu. Let me also add that calling Bhakti a movement is an act of retrospection. We always speak of Bhakti movement, but we are doing it today. If you go back to its own time, it did not look like a movement. Today we take them together and call it a movement. As it was spread over several centuries, from the 6th to the 19th, and did not happen simultaneously in all languages and regions. Still, the movement in most parts had certain common features, though expressed in different ways and forms natural to the languages and the cultures of the people. One, most of the Bhakti movements and their creative leaders had a predilection for pre-Vedic God. These are some of the common elements which gave it the semblance of a movement. One is a predilection for pre-Vedic gods like Shiva, Vishnu or Krishna, Shakti or Kali, the goddess, for example. And their patterns of life and thought as implied in the rejection of Brahmin privilege, its egalitarian philosophy, and the tribal character of its collective worship. Secondly, they emphasized the similarities among different religions and cults, finding them to be only different parts leading to the same goal, and even attempted synthesis of religions, as in Sikhism, founded by Guru Nanak, and the different Sufi cults. Thirdly, most of them rejected the Varna Jati system and the superiority of the priestly class. Fourthly, they problematized and often rendered superfluous the institution of priesthood by directly addressing God. Fifthly, they privileged the oral tradition against the written. Sixthly, they deprivileged the Sanskrit language and chose to compose in the regional languages and dialects. In fact, they were the founding fathers of many, or the founding mothers of many of the languages, modern languages. And seven, they were often multilingual, easily traversing regions and crossing language barriers. I have already given the examples of Mira, Kabir, Namdev and Vidyapati. Eighthly, they created and introduced new forms of composing, singing, dancing and performing. Like, there are many examples, like Doha, Pada, Bijak, Ulat Basi, Vak, Abhang, Bharud, Bharamasa, Kasida, Rasa, Vachana, Kummi, Prabantha, Kirtan, Bhajan, Thun, Jatha, Burakatha, Harikatha, Angiyanat, Nagara Sankirtana, Tungi, Ramlila, Krishnalila, Tullal, Kathakali, Yakshagana, Bharatanatyam, Kuchipudi, Manipuri, Odissi. All these forms of dance, theatre, poetry, they came to be established as part of this bhakti. So that means it was a major renaissance, not only literary but also artistic. Most of them came to be established or propagated and popularized during the bhakti period. And ninthly, poetry and philosophy coexisted and supported each other, and the barriers between the physical and the metaphysical grew thin in their aesthetic religious practice. The clear boundaries between the physical and the metaphysical were crossed, and also between poetry and philosophy. The Shamaskantha of Bhagavata, for example, is pure philosophy. By Western standards, they would not call it poetry, they would call it philosophy. Similarly, Bhagavad Gita, you can call it poetry, you can call it philosophy. The boundaries and the definitions seem to be blurred. And tenthly, they developed a symbolism of their own, mixing traditional symbols like water, fire, river, sky, bird, tree, etc., and symbols chosen from the kitchen and the workplace like the loom, wheel, knife, ladle, bellows, veil, sindoor, bangles, etc. 11thly, many of them formed alternative egalitarian communities like the Veerashaivas of Karnataka and the Varkaris of Maharashtra. Thus, looking back, it looks like a comprehensive cultural revolution with profound ideological, aesthetic and practical implications that attempted to create an alternative religion of the people, articulating subaltern aspirations at the material as well as spiritual levels. I will leave this paper here because I have looked closely at the Bhakti movement in different languages. So only one point I would like to make is the interrogation of the existing customs and rituals and even beliefs that most of the Bhakti poets did. It begins from the Tamil Shaivites, like Chivavakiyar, for example. Do gods ever become stone? It's interrogating idol worship. Or, of what use are temples, and of what use the temple tanks? Again, this is Chivavakya. Chiva is Shiva. Shivavakya. He denounced. He was a great major Shaivite in the pantheon, and they denounced the theories of transmigration of the soul and of rebirth also. Milk does not go back to the udder. Likewise, butter can never become buttermilk. The sound of the conch does not exist once it is broken. The blown flower, the fallen fruit do not go back to the tree. The dead are never born again, never. So they denied the idea, many of them denied the idea of rebirth. Again, they questioned caste. This is Pambati Chittar, who was supposed to have been a snake charmer. Because among these Siddhars or the Shaivites, there were people, there were peasants, there were snake charmers, there were various kinds of craftsmen, weavers, spinners, porters, and it is said that there were even professional thieves among these people. Because if you look at Periya Puranam, which is a hagiographical account of the Shaivites, you find there were people of various kinds. There were sex workers. There are various kinds of people from different professions who became Shaivites. And this is Pambati Chittar, a snake charmer Shaivite. We will set fire to the divisions of caste. We will debate philosophy in the marketplaces. We will have dealings with the despised households. We will go around in different parts. So all these go to show that this was a very radical tradition, where you had, as I said, people fishermen and hunters and washermen and oil pressers and pariahs and people coming from the lowest of the lowly in the society and trying to speak of perhaps an alternative idea of religion itself, denouncing the existing idea of religion, the hegemonic idea of religion, and questioning that and trying to create a religion of the people. And this happened not only in Tamil, but in other, you had Alama Prabhu or Basava or Akka Mahadevi or Devara Dasimaya or Dasreshwara in Kannada, or Vemana and Tikana and here, or you had Namdev and Yandev, Chokamela and Karmamela in Marathi. You had Kabir and Raidas and Meera and quite a few others in Braj and the older forms of modern Hindi. And you had, say, Chaitanya in Bengal. So, if you look at different parts of India, you had different poets who strangely seem to voice the same kind of concerns. So, that is what makes it, gives it the semblance of a movement. Their concerns were very similar. Because, see, Basava also spoke in a language which is very similar to the language of the Tamil Shaivers, the Tamil Shaivite poets. Basava says, to him who has self-understanding, there is but one caste. Or, the birthless has no caste mark, caste distinctions, no ritual pollution. Or, there is no other heaven and hell. Truth speaking is heaven, lying hell. Performance of right conduct heaven, its non-performance hell. Or, our untouchable Chennaiya is my father. Drummer Kakaiya is grandpa. Look, Chikkaiya is our boatman. Flutist Bommaiya is my brother. How can they not know me? That is establishing a kind of fraternity among the different castes and denouncing completely the the idea of inequality based on caste, based on color, based on race, and various other forms of distinction. So similar examples you will find also in Kabir. You will find in women poets like Meera and Lal Ded and Akka Mahadevi. You will find a questioning of gender distinctions and a foregrounding of women's aspirations, and they even denounce home, the idea of a family. And if you look at their biographies, you find that most of them had also very tragic domestic experiences, which forced them to leave their homes. Like Meera, she was also even given poison by the prince by her brother, because she was wandering along with monks on the streets. And Akka Mahadevi and Lal Ded also had experiences which were not congenial in the domestic context. And so they spoke against patriarchy, against men's oppression of women, and dreamt of a freer life for women in general. So the Bhakti, and I have not discussed Sufi movement, but the Sufi movement also, the Sufis also denounced priesthood. They also stood for various egalitarian concerns. And if you go to, say, someone like Bulle Shah, you will find how the priests were denounced. So Lumpens live in Hindu temples and sharks in the Sikh shrines. Musclemen live in Muslim mosques and lovers live in their clime. So they denounced the temples and shrines and mosques all together. Or the mullahs and the qazis show me the light leading to the maze of superstition. That is again Bulle Shah, the great Punjabi Sufi. With religious and social taboos, they have tied my feet tight. They go to Mecca to atone. I have many a Mecca in my home. Pour not on prayers. Forget the fast. Wipe off kalma from the sight. Bulle has found his lover within. Others grope in the pitch dark night. A lover of God, they will make much fuss. They will call you a kafir. You should say yes, yes. This is Bulle Shah again. So that means all these poets, generally the Bhakti and the Sufi poets, they denounce the existing idea of religion with the priesthood and the temple and the mosque and the church and all that, and they dreamt of another form of spirituality which could exist inside you and which would not teach you to hate other sections of the society, people of other religions and other denominations. And Bhakti Sufi movements may be said to have laid the solid foundations of what we today call Indian literature, the basic principles of modern literatures in India, in definite ways, as they interrogated hierarchies, promulgated the egalitarian ideal, upheld the freedom of the spirit, and were secular spiritual. It was these ideas that inspired, this concluding part, I'll just wind up. It was these ideas that inspired later movements like the anti-colonial and reformist trends in pre-independent India. The trends began to surface strongly in the second half of the 19th century. That was again a defining moment of turbulence in Indian history, both social and literary. The spread of education, translations of Sanskrit and Western classics into modern Indian languages, giving them norms and standards to aspire to, the arrival of the printing press, the rise of prose genres like the novel, the short story, the prose play, the essay, literary criticism, the travelogue, the autobiography and biography, the arrival of new forms of poetry like the lyric, the sonnet and the dramatic monologue, the emergence of literary journals and associations of writers and readers, a public sphere in the Habermasian sense had clearly emerged in most languages by the beginning of the 20th century. The literature of the period had two chief preoccupations: resisting British colonialism and reforming Indian society from within. The poetry of Ghulam Majoo, Rabindranath Tagore, Nasrul Islam, Sumitranandan Pant, quite a lot of others, Kumaran Ashan, N.S. Bendre, Veerashalingam, quite a few others, while celebrating the virtues of India's unique intellectual and spiritual traditions and popular resistance against oppressors, is also critical of the inequality, poverty, caste system, superstitions, and meaningless rituals that haunted the Indian society. In fact, most of them can be their roots can be found in the Bhakti poetry and its reformist aspirations. The secular spirituality of this literature is also akin to that of the Bhakti Sufi movements. The early Indian novels, say, of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Govardhan Tripathi, H.N. Apte, C.V. Raman Pillai, O. Chandu Menon, and others, also reflect a deep awareness of the paradoxes of Indian life as felt in their own regions. The West is a strong presence in these novels in several ways. It is there as a culture received through modern education, to be encountered, made use of, challenged, and exorcised. Tagore's Gora is in some sense a paradigmatic text setting the agenda for those who wish to fight colonialism. In his anxiety to be authentic to himself, Gora, the protagonist, has to abandon not only his urbanism and fanaticism, but his self-righteousness as well. This is an anxiety carried on by several post-independence novels, like U.R. Anandamurthy's Samskara. The progressive movement, influenced by Gandhian as well as Marxian ideals, was an offshoot of the reformist literature with which it coexisted and linked to the debates over decolonization and the nature of the post-colonial nation-state that was to come into being. Pioneered by Mulk Raj Anand, Sajjad Sahir and Premchand, and blessed by writers like Tagore, the movement brought together people from diverse ideological backgrounds who, however, shared a concern for the society in the making. There were very few writers in India totally unaffected by the ideals of the movement. The fact that writers as diverse as Thakazhi Shivashankara Pillai, Jayakanthan, Vinda Karandikar, Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay, Sarath Hasan Manto, Ismat Chuktai, to take some examples, Yashpal and Nagarjun, associated themselves with the movement proves its broad and inclusive base in the early days. The ideological field of the nation of this time exploded into a terrain of struggle for several social and political forces that were getting organized around issues ranging from gender, caste, and religion to class, language, and region. A struggle inflected by the anti-imperialist struggles in Asia and Africa and the anti-fascist struggles in Europe. The writers in the movement, along with the large body of co-travelers outside it, represented an energy, a stubborn force engaging as a committed and recognizable voice in language and society with a whole slew of issues, all of them having to do with a combination of enlightenment and emancipation or freedom, to use the qualification that Edward Said attributes to the modern intellectual. While its impact was felt across the country, the movement was stronger in certain languages, like Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Tamil, Telugu, and Malayalam. The concerns varied according to the regions and also the communities that sought representation in the literary discourse and those that represented them. Dalits and tribals, for example, were most often represented through the non-Dalits in that phase. Say like Thakazhi Shivashankara Pillai or Gopinath Mohanty or later by Mahashweta Devi. Even women were not necessarily represented by women writers, and the gender issue was seldom foregrounded as the class was the defining category. Still, the origins of several recent literary movements based on identity, like the Dalit, Adivasi, feminist and nativist, can be traced to the progressive movement, though the movement itself got fragmented later for ideological reasons. The realism of the progressives in the late 30s and 40s was to be challenged in the 50s and the 60s by the modernists, when the personal subjective element came to the fore, obscuring the objective social element which was not entirely absent from the modernist works. From the 70s onwards, realism of a kind seems to have been on a strong comeback trail in many of the language literatures of India. I am discussing these in some detail in my I'm not going to that. This brief examination of some of the key moments in the evolution of India's literature is enough to prove the variety as well as the common sources and concerns of our literature. So even if you take just the three movements, Bhakti movement, the independence related, independence and social reform movement, and the progressive movement, you will see how they had a lot in common. At the same time, how they were expressed differently depending on the genius of the language in which it was expressed and depending on the social milieu in which it was getting expressed. So even these three movements would be enough to speak to show us the variety, the diversity, as well as the unity, as the common links of Indian literatures. After more than 5 decades of independence and 500 years of imperial and colonial rule, it is imperative that we rethink concepts like Indianness and Indian literature. One may then be able to unveil the complicity of these concepts with the ideology of colonialism on the one hand and globalization on the other. We have come a long way since the German Romantic theorist Wilhelm von Schlegel used the term Indian literature to mean Sanskrit literature. Since then, many other scholars have used the term as being synonymous with Sanskrit literature, at the most extended to include Prakrit, Abhramsh, and Pali literatures. Indian literature, if you look at the early histories of Indian literature by Germans and the British, were all histories of mainly Sanskrit literature, along with some of these Pali Prakrit literatures. Like Garcin de Tassi's 2-volume History of the Literature of the Hindus and the Hindustani, a French book, later revised and enlarged as a 3-volume edition, 1870-71. Albert Weber's History of Indian Literature in German, 1852. George Grierson's Modern Vernacular Literature of Hindustan, 1889. Ernest Horowitz's A Short History of Indian Literature, and Maurice Winternit's History of Indian Literature, 1908 to 1922 in German, and Herbert Gowen's History of Indian Literature, have all contributed to the constitution of the category of Indian literature. Most of these do not represent or underrepresent the literatures in the modern Indian languages that were fully grown by the time, and many even had their own histories of literature written in the concerned language itself. So this is a fact that we need to seriously take note of, because in all the early histories of Indian literature presented Sanskrit literature as Indian literature. Remember, they were written in in late 19th century, even early 20th century, by which time all the regional languages had flowered and come up with a lot of movements, a wonderful text, great poetry, and fiction was emerging in most of these languages. And in spite of that, there is hardly any mention of any of these literatures in the so-called histories of Indian literature. So Sanskrit was posited by them as the classical code of early India, congruent with new linked conceptions of classicism and class. One has also to see that many Indian texts like Bhagavad Gita, Manusmriti, and Arthashastra were translated by the Orientalists for colonial rulers so that they can better understand the people they had to deal with and to control. Tejaswini Niranjana has closely looked at the colonial agenda behind the translation of such texts into English that were mostly done by Western scholars, as the masters did not trust native translators, because they thought the native translators would translate wrongly and cheat them. So they wanted their own people to translate so that they will know what exactly Manusmriti says, or Bhagavad Gita says. Literary works were also translated with this purpose in mind, and as Kate Telsher says, a major Indian scholar, they were translated into a European code, she says. She points out how the English translation of Kalidasa's Shakuntalam echoed Shakespeare, and how it was treated as a romantic comedy. Shakuntalam was treated as a romantic comedy, which was a genre we never had. Romila Thapar also, I'm sure you have read this book, her study of Shakuntala texts, readings, histories, has looked at the reasons for the rare reception of the play received in the West, as Kalidasa's heroine, unlike Vyasa's independent and assertive Shakuntala, fitted well with the Orientalist concept of the coy, vulnerable, naive, and beautiful, exotic Oriental woman. Thapar may be simplifying a bit, ignoring some of the aesthetic elements, but she has a major truth in the way she compares Vyasa's or Mahabharata's Shakuntala and Shakuntalam's Shakuntala, because the Shakuntala of Mahabharata is an independent woman. She is strong, she has a will of her own. She questions Dushyanta's sense of justice, while in the Kalidasa's heroine is typically a vulnerable woman, very coy, very naive, beautiful, exotic, and that fitted very well, as Romela says, with the concept of the Eastern woman that the Orientalists generally had. Someone growing up in the wild, innocently, having no idea of the world, and wonderstruck by when she meets a man for the first time, a young man for the first time. So it fitted well with the Orientalist concept of the coy, vulnerable, beautiful, exotic Oriental woman. Shakuntala was also metaphorically the wild, feminine, and rustic India, while Dushyanta was the urban, powerful, and masculine England. That is the political reading. These representations have larger implications, as the whole colonial epistemology is based on a positivist belief in a non-political and unbiased science whose objectivity was ensured through a distanced neutrality. The whole Enlightenment rationality was based on a denial of keyvalness, as that we find in the science of anthropology that objectifies its subjects of study and posits them in a distant time. Colonial historiography also looks at Europe. Sir, you can leave if you stay. Yeah, just come. The whole Enlightenment rationality was based on a denial of keyvalness, as that we find in the science of anthropology that objectifies its subjects of study and posits them in a distant time. Colonial historiography, too, looks at Europe as universal, and European male as the ultimate human being, thus placing cultures in an unreal hierarchy in an evolutionary pattern of time, where India will be seen as Europe's past and Europe as India's only possible future. Today perhaps it is America which is supposed to be India's only possible future. It is essential thus to escape the colonial paradigm, to freely look at India's history as well as Indian literature, for, as Michel Foucault says, it is not enough for us to liberate the individual from the state and its institutions, but to liberate us both from the state and a type of individuation linked to the state, so that we develop and promote new forms of subjectivity. India and Indian literature were constituted as a site of knowledge in the context of its encounter with Europe, and hence today we need to decolonize ourselves by critiquing all those attitudes and processes that give rise to discourses that other the Eastern nations and cultures, the othering discourses, or the Orientalist European discourses. Indian thinkers also have discussed this category of Indian literature, like Sri Aurobindo, Krishna Kripalani, Sunita Kumar Chatterjee, V.K. Gokak, Umashankar Joshi, Sujit Mukherjee, Shishir Kumar Das, Ganesh Devi, quite a few of the scholars have elaborated the concept of a posited unity of diverse language formations, or as the articulation of Indian culture. Ijaz Ahmad, in his essay on Indian literature in theory, has acknowledged the difficulties of positing an Indian literature, positing such a unitary category. He has raised certain problems about Indian literature as a unitary category. T.R.S. Sharma has pointed to the European neglect of the Indian languages in his introduction to Ancient Indian Literature, an anthology edited by him. I quote him, "While many European scholars had translated entire works of Sanskrit, few of them had ventured into Prakrit and Abhramsh, and none into Kannada." Kannada, he is taking an example. There is Tamil and other languages. This is also true of other languages, often including classical languages like Tamil. Or we can say, even today, European scholars of modern South Asian languages and literatures feel compelled to legitimize themselves and their fields of study, working as they do in departments of South Asian studies, at times designated even now as departments of Indology, that are dominated largely by classical Sanskrit scholars. So the constitution of Indology itself is a major problem which one needs to really discuss. How was it constituted, and what was its subject of study, and what kind of India was constituted by this science called Indology. Pointing to the introduction of narrative narrative strategies, essays on South Asian literature and film by Vasudha Dalmia and Theo Damstedt, where they claim to let the world know the seriousness of their discipline, he points out how their statement is unabashedly Eurocentric and ignorant or deliberately neglectful of the enormous scholarship that has been produced on Indian literature by scholars of various hues from the South Asian subcontinent. It is disgraceful that the attitude of European scholarship to this mighty archive remains unchanged since the 19th century. All these works also share the class and caste prejudices of the tradition of the Sanskrit-based Hindu orthodoxy. Only recently have some scholars, like Sheldon Pollock, begun to realize this, as is evident from his introduction to the great work, Literary Cultures and History, Reconstitutions from South Asia, where the language literatures have been treated in isolation as also in relation to other language literatures in India. I quote Sheldon Pollock, with very few exceptions, European histories of Indian literature remained histories of Sanskrit and its congener. Please don't imagine that I'm speaking against Sanskrit. I have great respect for Sanskrit literature, Sanskrit poetics, and the great philosophy that is expressed in Sanskrit. But the question is whether that alone constituted Indian literature or Indian philosophy for that matter. With very few exceptions, European histories of Indian literature remained histories of Sanskrit and its congeners. The real plurality of literatures in South Asia and their dynamic and long-term interaction were scarcely recognized, except perhaps incidentally by Protestant missionaries and British civil servants who were prompted by the practical objectives of conversion and control. Pollock also examines how the subaltern school of historiography has sought to redirect the study of 19th and early 20th Indian society and politics towards the popular, the vernacular, the oral, and the local, and to recapture the role of small people in effecting big historical change. I quote him, contemporary analysis of colonialism have shown how new Indian pasts with real-life social consequences, such as the traditionalization of the social order by the systematic miscognition of indigenous discourses on caste, were created by colonial knowledge. They have demonstrated at the same time how discourses such as nationalism that were borrowed from Europe entered into complex interaction with the local modes of thought and action that, through a process not unlike import substitution, appropriated, rejected, transformed, and replaced them. He goes on to say how the re-examination of theory, practice, and history of areas, especially driven by the analysis of globalization, has made us aware of the artificiality of geographical boundaries of inquiry. To conclude, today we need to develop alternative genealogies that go beyond the hegemonic canon and travel to the deepest springs of our people's creativity. Rather than a mechanical unitary concept, we need to develop a comparative concept, a fresh literary cartography marking areas of isolation and interaction, patterns specific to languages, and influences that they share. Only then will we be able to overcome the binary opposition between the singular and the plural as irreconcilable antinomies and arrive at a dialectical concept of Indian literature in the twin aspects of unity and diversity. Thank you very much.